Hello again. So in class, we'll have been discussing the big events that lead to the collapse of the Roman Empire. Aha, but is it the Roman Empire? And I hope at this point you're saying to your computer or phone screen, no, it is not the fall of the Roman Empire. It's the fall of half of the Roman Empire. We've been discussing more of these causes in class, but we've actually already identified one through our previous videos, and that one is, of course, the quality of the emperor himself. Some were very good, and some were not. Let's just say not. So we've been discussing how there was, after Trajan, after the good emperors, there really isn't a unified Roman Empire. And really it's split in half. And when we talk about the Byzantines, which we're going to be doing in class, we're going to be talking about the yellow colored area on this slide. What we're going to do in this video is start to look at the more colorful parts located to the west. What you're looking at here is Europe around the year 500. You've got an orange bit, you've got a sort of beigey bit, you've got a green bit, you've got pinky bits, orange bits, right? Ooh, lots of colors. And this is, believe me, very oversimplified. So let's look at what has been going on here. If you see this year 500 and what we were doing in class, you'll know that this is after the end of the Western Roman Empire, which ends in 476. But of course, we're going to talk about the Byzantines in class. This yellow bit is still, everything is awesome. But by 500, there's no more Western Roman Empire. Part of the reason for this is our issues with the emperors, but another cause is that very capable new groups start to put pressure on the borders of the Roman Empire, particularly the western parts. Now, while in class we're going to talk about this yellow bit, Byzantium, because it's actually pretty hard to get our heads around. So that's why I want to make sure everybody's on the same page about Byzantium and we're doing it in class rather than through Nearpod. We will be spending the vast majority of the rest of the semester looking at what was the Western Roman Empire. So these multicolored bits are going to be super relevant to us in future weeks. So these groups on the left, which is the West, we, not you, there's no good word to describe all of these groups together. Yeah, there's a couple that we use. One of them is barbarian, like on this map. But it's not very good for reasons we'll be discussing in class. Another alternative is Germanic tribes, and this is also on the map, sort of like written right across Europe, Germanic tribes. And that comes from, as I mentioned in our very first video in Nearpod, that the Romans called like that kind of area that's vaguely modern Germany, but lots of other places too, Germania. And it's not Germany, but from Germania we get the term Germanic. So a problem for calling these tribes Germanic is, well, they're not actually anywhere near Germany, are they? Look, there's the Sueves who are in Portugal and Spain. There's the Vandals who are in North Africa. I mean, there's really, nothing very Germany about this. So Germanic is actually kind of misleading to our modern conception of the term. Now, lots of these groups overlapped with the end of the Roman Empire. But what we're particularly interested in now is we're going to wave a big goodbye to Western Rome. We're not really going to see it again. Instead, we're going to say a big hello to the early Middle Ages. Now, what I'm going to talk about are some of these groups, the most important ones to know for the early Middle Ages. Most of them are actually shown in this map. We're going to look at the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, and the Anglo-Saxons. And then we're going to stay with the Anglo-Saxons and look at some like gnarly stuff to do with the Anglo-Saxons from archaeology. All right, so first off, the Visigoths. I'm going to start with the Visigoths because they actually, overlap with the end of the Roman Empire. And originally, if you flip back here, we have, oh look, we've got Visigoths and Ostrogoths. What's the connection? Well, originally they were Goths, all just Goths, but they split up over time into the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, two different tribes. So the Visigoths had come from the east. They were moving westwards. They had crossed one of Rome's major frontiers, and that is what is shown on this map, the Danube. And the Danube is a great big river, as you can see, running through a lot of Central and Eastern Europe. So the Visigoths were the first tribe to cross this Roman frontier, the Danube, and by crossing into the Roman Empire, kind of put the wind up the Romans, but also the Romans were like, hey, here's an opportunity. We've got problems. These guys might help us solve them. So the Visigoths were the first tribe to become Roman federates. And what a federates means is that they have a special deal with the Roman Empire. They are going to farm and protect this frontier for the Romans. And in exchange, the Romans are going to give them land and the Romans are going to pay them. They're also going to form a big chunk of the Roman army because Rome needs an army to support the empire, but nobody wants to actually, go from Rome, the amazing city, to go and live on the Danubian frontier. So instead, they have to pay these guys to do it for them. Issues started when Rome stopped paying their side of the bargain. So the Visigoths and the Romans were kind of at each other for a good while. So the Visigoths claimed the Romans broke the treaty. The Romans had lots of other issues, as we know by now, and in fact they actually even went to war over it. The Visigoths in 378 defeated the Romans at the Battle of Adrianople, and at which the Emperor Valens was killed. So we're talking about 476 as the end of the Western Roman Empire. This is 378. This is not a sudden collapse. The causes of this are really, really, really far-reaching. Now, the overall movement here is from the east, and they're moving westwards, and they are being moved by the Huns. You probably heard of Attila the Hun. It's these guys. They're coming in from the east, and they're displacing and turning people into refugees as they go. In part, they're moving the Visigoths away from where they had been originally and even closer to the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. And this really scares the Eastern Romans. They end up going westwards. One of their most famous leaders was a guy called Alaric. He brought the Visigoths into Italy, and they even got as far as Rome. They kept on moving, though. They really go, we're talking over many, many generations here, but overall, they move very far from the east to the west. They eventually move into Spain. And they're thinking, hey, we might go to Africa, but the Romans call them back and are like, hey, guys, we'll do a new deal. We'll give you a big chunk of land in what they call Gaul, and we call France today. And in exchange, you Visigoths will adopt Romanized ways. You'll speak Latin, you'll dress like us, you'll live in our big drafty houses. But the Visigoths ended up becoming the elites in the south of France and in Spain as well. And Spain is really interesting because we're actually, the last video you're going to watch today is going to be about Spain, Islamic Spain, moving forward in time. Before it was Islamic Spain, it was Visigothic Spain. So we're going to see what happens there. And we say no more Visigoths by the time we hit the 8th century. Now, there's also the Ostrogoths, not just the Visigoths. One of their most famous ones is a guy called Theodoric. And Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, he got on very well with the Romans. But in 493, he formed a treaty with a guy called Odoacer or Odovacar, and we'll be talking about that guy in class. And we know him because he's the one who deposes the last Western Roman emperor. Theodoric, though, you might be satisfied to know that Theodoric says Odoacer is reneged on his side of the deal, and Theodoric kills Odoacer, and that means that the Ostrogoths, led by Theodoric, get Italy. Yeah, so things have got so bad for Western Rome that the Western Romans don't even control Italy anymore. It's Ostrogothic Italy. So, Italy, we're going to talk about Italy a lot in this class, and I'm just going to tell you now, okay? The best way to describe Italy in the early Middle Ages, and actually in big chunks of the High Middle Ages too, is a hot mess. So when I ask you in class, what was Italy politically in the Middle Ages? You can chorus back at me, it's a hot mess. And that's because everybody wants a piece of Italy. Because, that's where Rome was. Everybody still wants, even though Rome's, not much there anymore, they want the cachet of having been in Rome. So, the Ostrogoths are in Italy, and then in class we're going to talk about the Byzantines, also in Italy. How confusing. That's because Italy is a hot mess. Okay. Vandals, though, maybe your mom has told you a vandal before because you kept breaking things on her. Well, they're actually named after one of these Germanic/barbarian tribes. The Vandals, as you can see from the big red arrows on this map, were in Spain, but who else is in Spain? The Visigoths. So the Visigoths are like, hey Vandals, you're not staying here, get out of Spain. So the Vandals cross into Africa and settle in North Africa, and they seize the Roman province of Carthage in 439. That had been part of the Roman Empire, and 439, we're still a generation before the end of the Western Roman Empire, and already bye-bye Roman territories in Northwest Africa. The Vandals, actually, what these other arrows coming up out of the north of Africa are meant to show is how skillful they were on the seas. They actually sacked Rome in 455, and what this map is trying to show is actually they sailed there to sack Rome. By the time we hit 476, it's kind of a rite of passage for every good barbarian warlord to sack Rome. Rome's just getting sacked constantly in the 5th century. Now, my penultimate group of Germanic tribes are the Franks, and these are an important one. We're going to talk about these guys loads next week in class, okay? What we need to know about the Franks is they're going to give their name to another country that we're familiar with today. That country is France. They find a whole civilization. We're going to talk about the Franks lots and lots, but they're also going to have another name, just to confuse us. Now, even though they actually go on to be super high profile in the Middle Ages, the Romans are not interested in the Franks. The Franks are a long way away from the stuff Rome really cares about. So we only actually find them being documented by the Romans until really quite late in the day. They never crossed the frontier. So, Rome had bigger problems to deal with. Why bother writing about some random tribe? They don't know they're going to become super important in the Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, though, what you need to know is that there were two big sub-tribes in the Franks. There's the Salians and there's the Merovingians, and they dominate at different times, and they make their own kings at different times. One of the biggest names to know from the early Middle Ages of the Franks is King Clovis. Now, a name like Clovis, he sounds like, he'd be a nice guy, but he's a hard ass. He expands the territory of the Franks hugely southward. He is the one who established a power base at Paris, still the capital of France. Also a big deal, and why we're going to talk about them in a lot more detail next week, is that King Clovis converts to Christianity. He also made everybody else become Christian. So he's like, I'm Christian, everybody else is going to become Christian. You become a Christian or you die. That's how Clovis worked. It also gave him a really good excuse to expand his territory, because guess what? His neighbors weren't Christians, so he was like, convert or I'm going to invade you. So that's also how we end up with this lovely multicolored shades of green map. A lot of it is Clovis making people convert. So we are going to be back with the Franks next week. Clovis is where we're going to start, and we're going to learn a lot more about them. But for now, let's hit our last groups, the Anglo-Saxons. Now, that is actually not one group. The Visigoths, the Franks, whatever, one group. Anglo-Saxons, is actually a term meaning lots of these different Germanic tribes. Two of them give the name, the Angles and the Saxons. And that's what gave the term the Anglo-Saxons. This whole period, as we'll talk about in class, is called the Age of Migrations. So that's because a lot of these different groups moved from the east to the west, and in this case, they moved into England. Now, we know that the Jutes also travelled from east into England, but it's not the Anglo-Saxon Jutes, probably because it's a mouthful. But there's other groups, like the Jutes there. They're a mishmash of different groups. They travelled to Britain in the period following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, because, you know, Britain is one of the furthest places from Rome. It's one of the first places they lose, therefore. They can't keep control over it. We know an awful lot about these groups, in part because of the writing, and particularly this guy on the right. He's called Bede, or more appropriately, he's called the Venerable Bede. He's a famous historian. He was writing in the early 8th century, so that means like the early 700s, and he was really interested in history. He wrote a history of Britain, and he collected documents to do it. And so although he is a secondary source, he is writing about a period much earlier. He's still our main written source on the Anglo-Saxons. And he's the one who says that they're all the descendants of the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. So this period in England, that is called Anglo-Saxon England, or it's also called Early England, is the period roughly 550 to 1066 AD. Now 550, yeah, that's tying in with lots of the trends we're talking about this class. 1066 might seem like a very precise number, and that's because it is. But we are going to talk about 1066 in a few weeks' time. So what we're talking about now is going to be relevant in the future. So we've got Bede, who's writing for us, but then we also know about the Anglo-Saxons because of their archaeology. One of them is their burials. People. Burials are a fascinating source of cultural information for most cultures, but particularly when we're looking at a society that is undergoing or has not yet undergone conversion to Christianity. That's because a lot of these pre-Christian groups have what we call grave goods. That's what archaeologists call them. And these are objects placed with the deceased at the time of burial. And that means when they excavate the grave, they find them with the body, like this picture here on the left. So for archaeologists, you know, understanding what these items are and what they mean can be really quite difficult. Some of them are going to be dress items. So, you know, they don't have zippers back then, but the modern day equivalent of zippers, or it might be personal items like jewelry, same as if, you know, we bury someone today, they might have their wedding ring still on. So it might actually tell us a bit about what they were dressed in. Some things are also personal items. Did they belong to the dead person, or were they left there as a gift by a mourner? We're not entirely sure. When people started to convert to Christianity in Britain, and we're going to talk about that next week, you know, Christians, you think about it, we don't, you know, they don't do very much when they bury people. Go into a coffin nowadays and you might have the wedding ring on, but, you know, we don't load you up with McDonald's Happy Meal toys, you know, to take with you into the afterlife. So Christian burials tend to be very simple. They also tend to be east-west oriented because they want to point eastwards because that's where Christ was. And then archaeologists find a Christian burial, and sometimes they get sad because they don't have any artifacts to date it from. But when it's pre-Christian, they might have stuff, and it might give us an idea of a pretty good date. So Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity. We'll be talking about that. But when we get them before they convert to Christianity, you find loads of cool things with their burials, like dress fittings, jewelry, and weapons. Now, one of the most famous ones of these sites to be excavated is a place called Sutton Hoo. And I'm really glad that I get to mention that in this nearpod, because it's probably the most famous Anglo-Saxon burial of them all. It's what we call a ship burial. But there's a movie coming out about it soon on Netflix. It's called The Dig. So this means that, you know, when everybody's talking about a movie, they watch on Netflix, you can be the know-it-all who studied it in their history class, and actually they've got this bit wrong, but this bit's right. So what we get from Sutton Hoo is like some really, really cool art. The Anglo-Saxons were particularly cool and nifty when it came to jewellery and metalworking. So this ship burial, as you can see, there's a picture from the original dig on the right there. I mean, it really is a ship. And then they buried stuff in it. And we think it probably is a royal burial because whoever was in there was super important from all the stuff that they had buried in this whopping great ship with them. And it seems to have been done in maybe the 620s. So that's actually around the time that the Anglo-Saxons were converting to Christianity. It was first excavated in 1939, but it's still being investigated to this day. It's still a major site that you study about. Thanks to this excavation, we don't any longer look at the Anglo-Saxons and the other, like, you know, Germanic groups as being inferior to the Romans. Because we were like, wow, they have such beautiful jewelry and their metalworking skills are like fantabulous. Guys, I'm sorry, there is a train going to go past and the horn is going to go while I'm talking. So apologies if you all get deafened in a second. But this is Sutton Hoo ship burial, loads of amazing jewellery and metalwork in it. This ship on the right is 27 metres long. That's a big, big ship. And at its centre, that's kind of where that plank is. What had been there was a burial chamber the size of a small room, and it'd been hung with textiles, and there was a dead man in there surrounded by, we presume, his possessions. So he had his weapons, he had his armour, he had gold coins, gold, garnet fittings, silver vessels, drinking horns, cups, symbols of power and authority and clothes. So many cool grave goods. So he must have been a king or important person. Now, we also have things called hoards. We're going to learn a lot about hoards in this class. So this is our first mention of hoards. This is a very famous one called the Staffordshire hoard. And that is all of it shown on a table here. This was found, how many years ago now? Maybe 8 years ago, less than 10, I think, anyway, in a farmer's field. And what is shown here is 3,500 items dating to around the 7th and 8th centuries. They valued this at over $5 million worth of gold and bling. Enough material to really advance our knowledge of the metalworking and art styles of the Anglo-Saxons. Despite, you know, if we see gold and jewellery and we're going to think, oh, women, actually this is a very masculine hoard. It's a hoard of male items. It seems to have been dumped there. A hoard means that something has been hidden away. You know, they didn't have banks in this time. They couldn't go and put it into a bank for safekeeping. What's the next best bet? Dig a whopping great hole in a field and hide it in a hole and hope you come back for it later. And this person evidently did not come back for it later. So why was this hoard there? Well, it looks like it's going to have been the spoils accumulated from military victories. It looks like these were trophies. Or maybe tribute. Maybe a king sent somebody out to collect tribute on his behalf and they went and collected it all together and they hid it. Maybe they went to war. You know, there's many reasons. But anyway, whoever it was lost the location or didn't get the opportunity to come back and find it. But now we know about it. Now, another type of burial is what we call deviant burials. And burials can tell us a lot about culture, but the deviant burials are the ones the students always really want to know about. Deviant means different, right? Different for whatever reason. For example, they could be hastily buried battle victims, they could be massacre victims, plague victims, but then there might be more sinister things. Again, there might be criminal executions. Judicial executions, what kind of things? Think about it. Would you might see if you were doing a political execution in the early Middle Ages. Have a look at these pictures. Guy on the left there, what's weird about him? And I know the picture is very grainy, but students usually can pick out what they need to see. And then on the right here, there's more than one, isn't there? And what's weird about this picture? This woman was found and excavated on the right, and then on the left this is a reconstruction drawing of what the archaeologists think had happened. But she has not been buried quite right. Okay, so have a look at them, have a think, and then I've put these pictures in a slide so you can like peer at them more closely in more detail, and your next activity is going to ask you what you think's going on in some of these pictures.